Millionaire asked Black Maid to play piano for fun. What happened next left everyone speechless. The boundaries between employer and employee blurred in an unexpected moment of musical revelation. A simple request would transform not only the atmosphere of a luxurious mansion, but the lives of everyone present that fateful evening. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. 15 years ago, Romina Johnson's hands had glided over the piano keys at Carnegie Hall, her future ablaze with promise. The standing ovation still echoed in her memory, the thunderous applause, the roses thrown at her feet, and Leonard Walker's proud smile from the front row. That night, critics had called her a once-in-a-generation talent and the future of American classical music. But that was before everything fell apart. Now those same hands scrubbed toilets in the Smith mansion, her brilliance hidden beneath a grey maid's uniform and a life of quiet servitude. The porcelain gleamed under her careful attention as she worked methodically, her movements precise, the same precision that had once brought Chopin and Liszt to life. The vast bathroom in the East Wing was larger than her entire apartment, its marble countertops and gold fixtures a daily reminder of the divide between her world and theirs. Every morning Romina woke before dawn in her tiny Bronx apartment, the distant rumble of the subway marking time like a metronome. The cramped space held few possessions, a silent keyboard tucked under her bed, a stack of dog-eared music theory books, and a small collection of photographs. In the blue darkness, she traced the faded edges of her favorite photograph, a younger version of herself, radiant at a grand piano, her mother standing proudly beside her. "Not today," she whispered, tucking the memory away in the drawer beside her bed. The ritual was always the same: acknowledge the past, then bury it again. The young woman in that photograph was gone, replaced by someone who moved through the world, trying not to be noticed. She pulled on worn jeans and a faded sweater before changing into a uniform at work. Gloria had taught her that trick years ago. Never let them see you coming or going as yourself, the head housekeeper had advised on Romina's first day. It's easier that way. As she locked her apartment door, Romina checked her phone. 4:30 in the morning. The Smith family would still be asleep for hours, nestled in their Egyptian cotton sheets, while she prepared their world for another day. She pulled her coat tighter against the pre-dawn chill, bracing herself for another day of invisibility, another day of being looked through rather than seen. The bus arrived with a hiss of breath. Romina boarded, her mind already running through the day's tasks, burying the music that always threatened to surface from somewhere deep within. At 5:30 in the morning, Romina Johnson slipped through the service entrance of the Smith estate, her footsteps barely audible against the polished marble floor. The sprawling mansion perched over New York City like a silent judge, its windows dark except for the security lights that cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. The early morning dew glistened on the grass, mirroring the coldness she felt deep within as she made her way to the staff changing area. The mansion was quiet at this hour, a rare moment of peace before the chaos of the day would begin. Romina hung her worn jacket on a hook and pulled out the grey uniform that rendered her nearly invisible to the family she served. As she buttoned the plain dress, she caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror. For a moment her fingers paused, remembering how they once danced across piano keys instead of scrubbing toilets and polishing silverware. "Morning, Romina," called out Gloria Brown, her voice warm in the sterile room. The head housekeeper was a sturdy woman with kind eyes that missed nothing. For years she had quietly mentored Romina, teaching her not just how to clean properly, but how to survive in a world that looked right through her. "You're early again." Gloria was already dressed in her uniform, her hair pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized the lines of experience on her face. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing the invisible machinery that kept wealthy homes running smoothly. "Big event today," Romina replied softly, clutching her clipboard with the day's endless list of tasks. The gala preparations meant double the work, triple the scrutiny, and quadruple the opportunity for Jennifer Smith to find fault with everything she did. "Robert's bringing in half of Manhattan's elite," Gloria said, checking supplies in the cleaning cart. "Quinn's already on edge. Snapped at 2 of the kitchen staff before sunrise." Romina nodded, mentally preparing herself for Quinn Davis's inevitable micromanagement. The estate manager took particular pleasure in reminding the staff of their place in the hierarchy, and Romina was often his favorite target. "Just keep your head down today," Gloria advised, placing a motherly hand on Romina's shoulder. "These fancy events make them all crazy." Romina forced a smile, though her stomach knotted with anxiety. "I always do." As they pushed their carts toward the main wing, the mansion began to awaken. Lights flickered on in distant rooms, and the faint sound of expensive shower systems hummed through the walls. Another day of invisibility was beginning, another day of burying her true self beneath the weight of other people's expectations. The Smith mansion vibrated with energy as staff rushed about in preparation for the evening ahead. Robert Smith, the billionaire real estate magnate, had orchestrated his annual charity gala, an event where the wealthy would gather to feel virtuous while writing tax-deductible checks. The grand ballroom was being transformed with crystal chandeliers and floral arrangements worth more than Romina Johnson earned in 3 months. Romina moved through the corridors like water finding its path, silent, efficient, and completely overlooked. She dusted ornate picture frames containing photos of the Smith family at exotic locations, careful not to leave fingerprints on the glass. Her grey uniform blended with the shadows as she emptied wastebaskets and straightened decorative pillows, her presence acknowledged only when something needed cleaning. "Make sure the bathrooms are spotless," Quinn Davis instructed as he passed, not bothering to slow his stride or make eye contact. "The Vandermeers are coming, and Mrs. Vandermeer inspects everything." "Yes, sir," Romina replied, though the estate manager had already turned the corner. As she worked her way through the sitting room with its plush velvet furniture and antique side tables, the unmistakable sound of a piano floated through the air. Someone was practicing in the music room, a Chopin nocturne that Romina had once performed at a recital when she was 14. The delicate melody wrapped around her like an old friend's embrace, pulling her back to a time when her future stretched bright and limitless before her. Without realizing it, Romina's fingers had stopped dusting. They hovered in mid-air, mimicking the fingering of the piece, muscle memory that 15 years couldn't erase. Her right hand trembled slightly as it followed the arpeggios, her body swaying imperceptibly with the rhythm. "It's Nocturne in E-flat major," a voice said, startling her. Gloria Brown stood in the doorway, a knowing look in her eyes. "You're playing along?" "I wasn't," Romina began, quickly resuming her dusting. "No shame in remembering who you are," the head housekeeper said quietly, placing fresh towels on a nearby table. "Just be careful who sees." The music shifted to a more complex passage, and Romina winced at a missed note. The guest pianist, likely hired for the evening's entertainment, continued undeterred. "They don't see us anyway," Romina whispered, more to herself than to Gloria. She straightened a crystal figurine worth more than her monthly rent, then moved to the next room, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand, rather than the music that continued to call to her like a siren's song. In this house of opulence, she was just another fixture as functional and unremarkable as the vacuum cleaner she pushed. But inside her, beneath layers of silence and servitude, something ancient and powerful stirred, awakened by Chopin's timeless notes. Romina's hand froze mid-polish as Michael Smith appeared in the doorway. Unlike his father Robert, the young man rarely graced the main floors of the mansion, preferring the solitude of his wing. His sudden presence startled her. "Do you like classical music, Miss Johnson?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the dismissive tone she'd grown accustomed to from the Smith family. Romina nodded, keeping her eyes downcast as she continued buffing the antique side table. "Yes, sir," she replied softly, her fingers betraying a slight tremor. The Chopin nocturne, drifting from the adjacent room, was pulling at something deep within her, memories she fought daily to suppress. "I thought so," Michael said, leaning against the doorframe. "I noticed you pause whenever you passed the music room." His observation was casual but perceptive. "Do you have a favorite composer?" She hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "I enjoy several," she answered vaguely, though her heart screamed names. Bach, Ellington, Gershwin, artists whose works had once flowed through her fingertips like water. Michael stepped further into the room, his interest seemingly genuine. "The pianist practicing now is quite good, though I've heard better." There was something in his tone, an invitation to conversation rather than the usual orders. Before Romina could respond, the sharp click of heels announced Jennifer Smith's arrival. The socialite swept into the room like a cold breeze, her laughter cutting through the momentary connection that had formed. "Michael, darling, what are you doing down here talking to the help?" Jennifer's voice dripped with amusement as she surveyed the room with critical eyes. Her gaze landed on Romina, who immediately intensified her polishing. "Just discussing music," Michael replied, his posture stiffening slightly. Jennifer's perfectly manicured finger pointed to a spot on the mahogany surface. "You missed a spot," she said, though Romina could see nothing there. "Daddy really should get better uniforms for the staff. These grey things are so depressing." The words sliced deeper than any direct insult. Romina felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller, more invisible, exactly as intended. "I think the uniforms are perfectly functional," Michael countered, but Jennifer was already moving on, linking her arm through her brother's. "Come, the Prestons just arrived with their daughter. You remember Olivia, don't you? Daddy thinks you two would make a splendid match." As they departed, Michael glanced back at Romina with an apologetic look. She returned to her work, shoulders hunched, the beautiful music now feeling like a mockery of the life she once had. The Polish rag moved in rhythm with the nocturne, the closest she would come to playing music in this house. Also, she thought, by midday the Smith mansion was alive with activity. Art dealers in tailored suits mingled with socialites draped in designer wear, their laughter echoing through the marble halls. The air hung heavy with expensive perfume and expectation as caterers weaved through the growing crowd with silver trays of champagne. Romina Johnson moved efficiently through the chaos, invisible despite her constant motion. She adjusted flower arrangements, polished already gleaming surfaces, and collected discarded napkins, all while keeping her eyes lowered, as was expected. "Johnson, the East Wing bathroom needs attention immediately," Quinn Davis called out, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. The estate manager stood with his ever-present clipboard, his posture rigid as he surveyed the staff's movements. "And make sure the piano in the main hall is dusted properly. We have actual musicians coming today." She nodded silently, accustomed to his pointed reminders of her position. Quinn had worked for the Smith family for 15 years and guarded the hierarchy of the household with religious fervor. "Yes, Miss Davis," she replied, gathering her cleaning supplies. As Romina made her way toward the East Wing, the crowd parted like water round a stone. The guests' eyes slid past her grey uniform as if she were merely another piece of furniture. She had mastered the art of moving without being seen, a skill both necessary for her job and painful to her soul. The main entrance doors swung open, and a hush fell over the gathering. Robert Smith entered, his 6'2" frame commanding immediate attention. The billionaire's silver hair caught the light from the crystal chandeliers, creating an almost halo-like effect that matched his carefully cultivated public image. His tailored suit probably cost more than Romina earned in 3 months. "Everything must be perfect today," he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the marble foyer. As he surveyed his domain, his gaze unexpectedly landed on Romina, who was carefully dusting the grand piano in the corner. Something in her posture, perhaps the way her fingers hovered reverently over the keys for just a moment too long, caught his attention. "You there," he called out, causing several guests turn and notice her for the first time. "Do you play the piano?" The question pierced through Romina's carefully constructed invisibility. Her heart hammered against her ribs as memories flooded back. Carnegie Hall, thunderous applause, her mother's proud tears. "A little, sir," she stammered, her voice barely audible, as she clutched her dusting cloth like a shield. The weight of dozens of curious gazes suddenly made her uniform feel too tight, too obvious. Robert's eyes narrowed with interest, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Jennifer Smith burst into laughter, the sound echoing across the marble floors of the mansion. "How adorable. Maybe she can entertain us at the gala, Daddy. The little staff talent show." Her perfectly manicured hand gestured dismissively toward Romina, as though the maid was some quaint curiosity rather than a human being. Robert Smith's eyes sparkled with mischief, the same look he got when closing ruthless business deals. Why not? For fun. These events can be so dull. He straightened his expensive suit jacket, already moving on mentally to his next task. The Hendersons are bringing that violinist everyone's talking about. Wouldn't it be amusing to have our staff perform too? The other guests tittered politely, exchanging glances that ranged from amusement to discomfort. Quinn Davis, standing nearby with a silver tray, kept his face carefully neutral, though his eyes betrayed a flash of sympathy for Romina. "I'll put you down for 15 minutes before dinner," Robert continued, not even looking at Romina as he made the decision. Something simple, of course, perhaps a little Mozart. Nothing too ambitious. Romina's heart raced wildly in her chest. The room seemed to tilt around her, the opulent surroundings blurring at the edges. Memories crashed over her like waves, her mother sitting beside her at their old upright piano, guiding her small hands across the keys. The thunderous applause at her first recital when she was just 7 years old. The promise she'd whispered at her mother's grave that she would never truly abandon her music, even when it hurt too much to play. "Yes, sir," she heard herself agree, her voice faint and distant as though someone else was speaking through her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched her cleaning cloth, muscle memory already awakening after years of dormancy. Michael Smith, standing in the doorway, frowned slightly at the exchange. Unlike his sister and father, he seemed to sense the weight of what had just transpired. His eyes met Romina's briefly, a silent question passing between them. The group moved on, their attention already captured by some new topic of conversation, a recent art acquisition or upcoming charity event, leaving Romina standing alone, breathless and shaken. The enormity of what she'd agreed to settled over her like a heavy cloak. After 15 years of silence, of burying her talent beneath a uniform of servitude, she would play again, not on her terms but as entertainment, a novelty act for the wealthy to mock. Gloria Brown appeared at her side, concern etched into her weathered face. "You okay?" she whispered, her sturdy presence a small comfort in the storm of Romina's thoughts. "I don't know," Romina answered honestly, her voice barely audible as the wealthy guests drifted toward the dining room, leaving her behind as they always did. The kitchen's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Gloria Brown cornered Romina near the industrial sink. The head housekeeper's sturdy frame blocked any escape route, her eyes narrowed with maternal concern. "Why'd you say yes?" Gloria pressed, lowering her voice to avoid the ears of other staff members bustling around them. "You know they're just looking for entertainment at your expense." Romina Johnson's hands trembled slightly as she scrubbed them under the running water, focusing on the sensation rather than the weight of Gloria's gaze. She offered a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Didn't feel like I had a choice," she replied softly, reaching for a paper towel. The truth hung unspoken between them. Refusing Robert Smith was never really an option for someone in her position. Gloria squeezed her shoulder. "You don't have to give them what they want, you know." But they both recognized the hollow reassurance for what it was. In the Smith mansion, staff desires always came second to the whims of the wealthy. Hours later, in her tiny Bronx apartment, Romina sat on the edge of her bed, the springs creaking beneath her weight. The distant wail of sirens and the rumble of traffic filtered through thin walls, a stark contrast to the palatial silence of the Smith estate. She reached beneath her bed, fingers searching until they connected with a battered leather suitcase. The clasps protested as she opened it, releasing the faint scent of aged paper and distant memories. Inside lay yellowed sheet music, dog-eared and marked with pencil notations in her younger handwriting. Her fingers traced the notes, feeling the ghosts of melodies she once brought to life. At the bottom of the case, protected by a plastic sleeve, was a photograph she both treasured and feared. A teenage Romina, beaming with unrestrained joy, stood beside Leonard Walker. The legendary jazz pianist had his arm around her shoulders, his weathered face creased with pride as they posed before his grand piano in Harlem. "Why, I'm sorry," she whispered to the image, to herself, to the music that had once defined her existence. Romina plugged in the silent keyboard she kept by her window. A poor substitute for a real piano, but all she could afford in this life. The plastic keys felt cold and artificial beneath her fingers, nothing like the warm ivory she remembered from Carnegie Hall. She closed her eyes, letting muscle memory guide her through a piece she hadn't played in 15 years. No sound emerged from the unpowered instrument, but in her mind the music soared. Complex jazz harmonies intertwined with classical structure, the unique style that had once marked her as special. Her fingers remembered what her soul could never forget, dancing across the keys in the silent apartment, preparing for a performance that would either redeem her or destroy what little she had left. Jennifer Smith gathered her socialite friends in the east wing of the mansion, her laughter echoing through the marble hallway. Dressed in designer clothes that cost more than Romina Johnson's monthly salary, she held court like a queen among her subjects. "You simply won't believe what Daddy's planned for the gala," Jennifer announced, her voice dripping with mockery. "Our maid thinks she can play piano. Can you imagine? Those hands that scrub our toilets touching the Steinway." Her friends erupted in cruel laughter, champagne glasses clinking as they exchanged knowing glances. One of them, a blonde woman in pearls, suggested they request chopsticks just to watch her struggle. Another wondered aloud if the help even knew how to read music. "It's going to be absolutely hilarious," Jennifer continued, completely oblivious to the figure lingering in the doorway. Michael Smith stood silently observing the scene with growing discomfort. Unlike his sister, he had noticed something in Romina's eyes when music was mentioned, a flash of recognition, perhaps even passion. The young man had spent the past few days watching the maid from a distance, noting how her fingers sometimes tapped rhythmically while she dusted the bookshelves, or how she paused momentarily when passing the grand piano in the main hall. Later that afternoon, Michael approached Romina as she organized the linen closet. "I have some sheet music in my collection," he offered gently. "Perhaps something you might like to play at the gala." Romina looked up, surprised by his kindness. "Thank you, Miss Smith, but that won't be necessary," she replied, her voice soft but firm. There was dignity in her refusal that only deepened his curiosity. Just as she finished speaking, Quinn Davis appeared, his authoritative presence filling the narrow hallway. The estate manager thrust a manila folder toward her. "Mr. Robert thought you might need these," Quinn said with barely concealed condescension. "Simple pieces, beginner level. Shouldn't be too challenging for someone with limited experience." Romina accepted the folder with a polite nod, her face betraying nothing, as she glanced at the elementary compositions inside. Mary Had a Little Lamb and other children's tunes. The insult was clear, but she merely thanked him and tucked the folder under her arm. As Quinn walked away, satisfied with his delivery of the subtle humiliation, Romina's expression hardened with quiet determination. In that moment, she made her decision. She would not play their games or perform the role they had assigned her. Instead, she would share something true, her own composition, the music that lived in her soul despite years of silence. It would mean exposing her past, revealing her true self, perhaps even losing her job. But some risks were worth taking. The New York Public Library stood as a sanctuary of peace amid the city's relentless rhythm. On her rare day off, Romina Johnson navigated through the grand reading room, her fingers tracing spines of music books she once knew by heart. She pulled volumes of classical compositions, jazz standards, and the pieces that had defined her youth before everything changed. "Chopin's Nocturnes," she whispered, photocopying pages with reverent care. These weren't for casual reading, they were her lifeline back to herself. As she gathered the warm papers from the machine, they slipped from her grasp, scattering across the polished floor. "Let me help you with those," a man said, kneeling beside her. His voice carried the practiced cadence of someone who spoke about music professionally. "Thank you," Romina murmured, eyes downcast as they collected the sheets together. The stranger paused, holding a page of Rachmaninoff. "Wait a minute," he said, studying her face with growing recognition. "Aren't you Romina Johnson, the pianist who performed at Carnegie Hall 15 years ago?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. "No," she lied, the denial automatic after years of burying her identity. "I just clean houses. You're mistaking me for someone else." Elliot Miller, his press badge partially visible beneath his jacket, tilted his head skeptically. "I never forget a performer who moves me. That recital, your interpretation of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, brought the audience to tears." "Yes, I really need to go," Romina said, hastily gathering the remaining sheets. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying the composure she fought to maintain. "I'm sorry if I've upset you," the critic said, handing her the last pages. "It's just that young pianist had such promise. Critics were calling her the next great American virtuoso." Then she vanished completely. Romina clutched the photocopies to her chest like armor. "Sometimes people disappear for good reasons," she said, her voice barely audible. As she hurried toward the exit, Elliot watched her retreating figure with professional curiosity. The way she held those music sheets, with the reverence of someone who understood their value, confirmed his suspicions. He'd been in the third row that night at Carnegie Hall, witnessing a 17-year-old girl command the stage with wisdom beyond her years. He'd written that she played not just with technical brilliance, but with the soul of someone who had lived several lifetimes. And now here she was, the disappeared prodigy, making photocopies in worn clothes, claiming to be a house cleaner. Elliot pulled out his smartphone, searching for old concert programs from 15 years ago. There she was, Romina Johnson, the brilliant young pianist who had made an entire audience weep, only to vanish without explanation from the world stage. The mansion fell into silence as midnight approached. Romina Johnson slipped through the darkened hallways, her footsteps barely audible against the plush carpet. She'd memorized which floorboards creaked, which doors hinged silently, and which security cameras had blind spots. Knowledge earned through months of invisible service. The music room beckoned like a forbidden sanctuary. Its grand piano, a gleaming ebony Steinway, sat bathed in moonlight streaming through tall windows. Romina hesitated at the threshold, her heart racing. She hadn't touched an instrument of this caliber in years. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the floorboard. "Our household believes in inclusion," Robert announced, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "At tomorrow's gala, we're even having our staff participate in the entertainment. One of our maids will play the piano, can you imagine?" The gathered guests murmured appreciatively, raising their glasses to toast his apparent generosity. None seemed to notice the cruel undercurrent beneath his words or the smirk that briefly crossed his face. "How progressive," remarked Cynthia Winters, a jewelry heiress whose family foundation regularly contributed to Robert's causes. "I don't think I've ever heard the help perform at these functions." "It will certainly add local color," added another donor with a knowing chuckle. Meanwhile, in the mansion's sprawling kitchen, Romina Johnson wiped down countertops as she hummed quietly to herself, lost in the melody. The tune flowed naturally from her lips as she worked, a haunting jazz composition that spoke of midnight streets and distant dreams. Gloria Brown paused at the doorway, dish towel in hand, her head tilted in recognition. The head housekeeper's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the younger woman. "That's Leonard Walker's Midnight in Harlem," Gloria remarked, stepping fully into the kitchen. "Not something you hear every day, especially not from someone who claims to play just a little piano." Romina's hands froze mid-wipe. She hadn't realized she'd been humming loudly enough for anyone to hear, let alone recognize the obscure composition. "Just something I heard once," she replied, quickly resuming her work, eyes fixed on the marble countertop. "It has a catchy melody." Gloria approached, her sturdy frame blocking Romina's path to the sink. "Leonard Walker doesn't write catchy melodies, chap. He writes complex jazz symphonies that only serious musicians can even appreciate, let alone remember." The older woman's gaze was penetrating but kind. Years of working in wealthy homes had taught Gloria to recognize pain disguised as composure. She saw it now in the tightness around Romina's eyes, in the careful way she held herself. "You don't have to tell me anything," Gloria said more softly. "But whatever you're hiding, whatever brought you to scrubbing floors instead of playing music, it's written all over you when you think no one's watching." Romina met her mentor's eyes briefly before looking away, her shoulders tense beneath her gray uniform. "We all have pasts," she whispered, the words barely audible over the kitchen's humming appliances. "Some are just easier to leave behind than others." Jennifer Smith lounged on the Italian leather sofa in her father's study, surrounded by her three closest friends from the Upper East Side. Their laughter echoed through the room as they sipped champagne from crystal flutes, discussing their latest plan to humiliate the help. "I've invited Julian Kent to the gala," Jennifer announced, her red-painted lips curling into a smile. "You know, the music critic who destroyed that soprano's career last year." Meredith, her blonde friend, clapped her hands in delight. "The one who wrote She Sounded Like a Dying Cat. That's absolutely wicked, Jen." "Our maid is going to play," Jennifer continued, barely containing her glee at the looming disaster. "Can you imagine? A toilet scrubber performing for New York's elite while Julian Kent watches. He'll tear her apart in his column." The group dissolved into cruel laughter, oblivious to Quinn Davis passing by the doorway. The estate manager paused momentarily, his face betraying nothing, though his grip tightened on the folder he carried. "What piece is she playing?" asked Sophia, twirling her pearl necklace. Jennifer shrugged. "Some beginner nonsense. Quinn gave her sheet music for children. I want her humiliation to be complete." Meanwhile, at the mansion's grand entrance, Elliot Miller presented his press credentials to security. The music critic had arranged to cover the gala under the pretense of writing about Robert Smith's philanthropy, but his true interest lay elsewhere. Since his encounter with Romina at the library, he had been piecing together a theory about her identity. As he was escorted through the marble foyer, Elliot spotted her. Romina Johnson moved efficiently through the room, arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. Her movements were precise, but her fingers lingered on each stem with a musician's delicacy. Elliot watched her with a mix of hope and disbelief. Those hands belonged to a pianist, not a maid. He recalled the prodigy who had moved audiences to tears 15 years ago, the same woman who now wore a grey uniform instead of concert attire. "Mr. Miller, this way, please," his guide instructed, leading him toward Robert's office. Before following, Elliot caught Romina's eye. A flicker of recognition passed between them. She quickly looked away, but not before he saw the fear in her expression. He was certain now that he had stumbled upon a story bigger than any society event, the mystery of why a once celebrated musician had disappeared from the spotlight to work as domestic help for one of the wealthiest families in America. As he was led away, Elliot resolved to uncover the truth, unaware that across town Julian Kent was already preparing his most scathing critique for what he assumed would be an amateur performance worthy of ridicule. Michael Smith found Romina Johnson in the library that afternoon, his footsteps quiet against the plush carpet. She was dusting the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls, her movements methodical and precise. When she turned and saw him watching her, she froze, a deer caught in headlights. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Smith?" she asked, her voice professionally detached. Michael leaned against a bookshelf, studying her with gentle curiosity. "Why are you hiding?" he asked softly. Romina's hand tightened around the feather duster. "I don't understand what you mean." "I know who you are," he said, pulling out his smartphone and showing her an old article. "Romina Johnson, piano prodigy who performed at Carnegie Hall at 17. Critics called you the voice of a generation. Then you disappeared." The color drained from her face as she stared at the screen. Her past life, displayed so casually in his palm. "How did you find this?" she whispered. "I heard you playing the other night," Michael admitted. "No one plays like that, without formal training. I was curious." Romina sank into a nearby chair, suddenly looking exhausted beyond her years. The weight of her double life seemed to press down on her shoulders. "My mother died," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "Cancer. We had no insurance. The medical bills." She shook her head. "Everything went. The piano, our apartment, my scholarship." Michael sat across from her, listening intently as she continued. "She was everything to me. My manager, my cheerleader. After she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to play anymore. It hurt too much." Romina's eyes grew distant, and then it became about survival. "Music became a luxury I couldn't afford." "But you still play," he observed, "in secret, when no one's watching." A bitter smile crossed her lips. 15 years of training doesn't just disappear." Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Then show them who you are. At the gala, play something real, not what they expect." Romina looked up at him, vulnerability etched across her face. For a moment the housekeeper vanished, and he could see the artist beneath. "I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's been so long since I performed for anyone who mattered." "You don't have to decide now," he said gently, "but think about it." The sound of heels clicking against marble interrupted them. Jennifer's voice echoed from the hallway, calling for her brother. Romina quickly stood, resuming her role as the invisible help, the mask of servitude sliding back into place. Michael watched the transformation with sadness, wondering if anyone else in his family could see what he saw. A brilliant light, deliberately dimmed. The morning light filtered through the mansion's windows as Romina Johnson sat alone at the grand piano, her fingers dancing across the keys with practiced precision. She played softly, not wanting to draw attention, yet the music flowed from her soul, complex harmonies that told her story of loss and resilience. From the doorway, Elliot Miller watched. The music critic silently pulled out his smartphone, capturing photos of the handwritten compositions scattered across the piano. These weren't simple pieces, they were masterworks, blending classical structure with jazz improvisation in a way that spoke of true genius. "That's extraordinary," he finally said, causing Romina to startle and immediately stop playing. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's nothing," she replied, hastily gathering her papers. "Just passing time before my shift starts." Elliot stepped closer. "We both know that's not true. May I?" He gestured to her compositions, and after a moment's hesitation she nodded. Meanwhile, in his office, Quinn Davis was making last-minute adjustments to the Gala program. "Miss Smith wants the Maid to perform between Natalie Brooks and Richard Williams," he announced to his assistant with a smirk. Natalie and Richard were acclaimed concert pianists. Placing Romina between them was clearly designed to highlight her inadequacy. "Make sure she understands her place in the lineup," Quinn added, his voice laced with the same class consciousness that permeated the entire household. Across the mansion, Jennifer Smith slipped into the staff locker room, her designer heels clicking against the tile floor. She scanned the small metal lockers until she found the one labeled R. Johnson. With a quick glance over her shoulder, the socialite jimmied the lock open and rifled through Romina's belongings. "Found you," she whispered triumphantly, pulling out a folder of sheet music. Jennifer's lips curled into a cruel smile as she tucked the papers under her arm and walked briskly to the kitchen. There, when no one was looking, she crumpled the precious compositions and buried them deep in the trash bin. Hours later, Romina discovered the theft. She tore through her locker, panic rising in her chest as she realized what had happened. Without her music, she would be forced to play the simple Mozart piece. Quinn had provided exactly what the Smiths expected of her. The humiliation would be complete. She sank to the floor of the locker room, her hands trembling. For the first time since agreeing to perform, Romina felt truly defeated. The music she had poured her heart into, her chance to reclaim her voice, was gone. And with it, her courage to stand before the wealthy audience as anything more than what they already saw, just a maid who had dared to dream beyond her station. Gloria Brown's keen eyes had spotted Jennifer's sabotage from across the kitchen. When Romina Johnson returned from her break, the head housekeeper was already fishing the crumpled sheets from beneath coffee grounds and vegetable peelings. "That girl has always been cruel," Gloria muttered, carefully smoothing the damp pages on the counter. "But she won't win this time." Romina stared at the torn music, her fingers trembling as she tried to piece together the fragments. Some sections were beyond repair, stained and ripped beyond recognition. The composition she'd poured her soul into, the one that told her story of loss and resilience, seemed irretrievable. "I can't play without this," she whispered, voice breaking. "I'll have to use the beginner pieces Quinn gave me." Just then Elliot Miller appeared at the service entrance, his press badge hanging around his neck. "I thought you might need these," he said, pulling out a folder. Inside were pristine printouts of her composition, the photos he'd secretly taken during her practice session. "You photographed my music?" Romina asked, stunned. The critic nodded. "I recognized greatness when I heard it. I wanted to preserve it, just in case." For the first time in years, Romina felt a flicker of hope warming her chest. Perhaps her voice, her true voice, might actually be heard. Later that evening, as she polished silverware for the gala, Michael Smith approached, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "I've invited someone to hear you play tomorrow," he said quietly. "Someone I think you'll want to see." When he mentioned Leonard Walker would be attending, Romina dropped the silver fork she'd been polishing. The legendary jazz pianist, her mentor, the man who'd discovered her talent in a community center when she was just 9 years old, was coming to hear her play. "He's in a wheelchair now," Michael explained, "but when I told him about you, he insisted on coming." Romina sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Leonard had believed in her when no one else did. After her mother died, she'd disappeared without explanation, abandoning her scholarship, her career, and the man who had championed her talent. "I don't know if I can face him," she confessed, tears welling in her eyes. "What if I disappoint him? What if I've lost everything he saw in me?" Michael placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He never stopped looking for you, Romina. He never stopped believing." That night, as she practiced on her silent keyboard in her tiny apartment, Romina wondered if she could honor the man who had first recognized her gift. Could she find the courage to play not just for herself, but for him? The night before the gala, when the Smith mansion stood quiet and the wealthy neighborhood slept, Romina Johnson slipped into the grand hall. Moonlight spilled through tall windows, illuminating the gleaming grand piano that waited center stage. She hadn't planned this midnight rehearsal, but anxiety had kept her awake in her tiny Bronx apartment until she'd finally surrendered to the pull of the music. Her fingers trembled slightly as she settled onto the bench. The polished keys reflected her face, tired, nervous, but somehow more alive than she'd been in years. Romina closed her eyes and began to play, her original composition flowing from some deep, wounded place within her. The melody started tentatively, like a question asked in darkness, before building into something that carried all her grief for her mother, her lost years, and the humiliation she'd endured in this very house. Unknown to her, Leonard Walker had arrived early for tomorrow's event. The legendary jazz pianist sat in his wheelchair in the shadowed doorway, watching his former protégé with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He hadn't heard her play in 15 years, not since before the tragedy that had stolen both her mother and her music. When the final notes faded, Romina opened her eyes to find Leonard wheeling toward her, his presence both shocking and somehow inevitable. "You've grown, little bird," he whispered, using the nickname from her childhood lessons. His voice cracked with emotion. "Your music has found its soul." Romina stood, trembling. Leonard, words failed her, as she rushed to embrace her mentor, the man who had believed in her talent long before Carnegie Hall, before everything fell apart. They talked until the first hint of dawn colored the sky, about her mother, about the years of silence, about washing floors while the music inside her refused to die. Leonard listened without judgment, occasionally squeezing her hand when words became too difficult. "Robert Smith has no idea what he's done," Leonard chuckled softly. "Inviting you to play as some sort of cruel joke. The universe has a sense of humor after all." As morning light began to fill the room, the elderly musician straightened in his wheelchair, his eyes bright with determination. "Play for me one more time, the piece you'll share tonight." Romina hesitated, then nodded. This time, she played with newfound confidence, the music soaring through the empty hall. It wasn't just her story anymore, it was a declaration of who she truly was, who she had always been beneath the gray uniform and quiet servitude. Leonard nodded approvingly. "Now they'll remember," he said simply. The Smith mansion glowed like a jewel against the night sky, transformed for the evening into a spectacle of wealth and artistry. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors, while waitstaff in crisp uniforms navigated between clusters of New York's elite. The air hummed with string quartet music, expensive perfume, and the distinctive clink of champagne flutes. In a small antechamber away from the glittering crowd, Romina Johnson sat alone, her hands folded in her lap. The borrowed black dress, lent by Gloria Brown with a whispered "knock 'em dead," felt foreign against her skin after years in gray uniform. She closed her eyes, letting the composition flow through her mind one final time, each note a testament to her journey. "5 minutes, Quinn Davis announced, poking his head through the doorway. The estate manager's expression betrayed his skepticism, clearly expecting disaster. "Mr. Smith wants you ready." Romina nodded, her throat too dry for words. Through the walls, she could hear the murmur of the gathering crowd, critics, musicians, philanthropists, all unaware they were about to witness something beyond a novelty act. The grand ballroom had been arranged concert-style, with the mansion's magnificent Steinway positioned center stage. Artwork worth millions adorned the walls, and floral arrangements perfumed the air. Michael Smith caught her eye from across the room and offered an encouraging nod, his quiet support a stark contrast to his family's casual cruelty. As the program progressed, Romina watched 2 renowned pianists perform to enthusiastic applause. Natalie Brooks played Debussy with delicate precision, while Richard Williams attacked Liszt with technical brilliance. Both received standing ovations from the appreciative audience. Then Robert Smith took the stage, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. His silver hair gleamed under the spotlights as he adjusted his custom tuxedo with practiced nonchalance. "Next we have something different," he announced, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "In the spirit of inclusion, we've invited a member of our household staff to perform." Titters of amusement rippled through the crowd. "Romina will now play a little something for us. Let's encourage her, shall we?" The polite applause that followed carried undertones of condescension. Jennifer Smith whispered audibly to Julian Kent, the notorious critic, who smirked in anticipation of amateur fumbling. Romina rose from her seat, legs trembling beneath the borrowed dress. As she crossed to the piano, she felt the weight of every gaze, curious, dismissive, mocking. The short walk seemed endless, each step carrying her further from the invisibility she'd hidden behind for 15 years. The bench felt cool beneath her as she adjusted her posture, muscle memory from another lifetime returning. Her fingers hovered above the keys as she took one deep breath, then another. In the front row, Leonard Walker sat in his wheelchair, his weathered face a beacon of faith. Romina Johnson sat at the grand piano, her hands trembling against the polished ivory keys. The gala audience watched with polite, expectant smiles, wealthy patrons in designer evening wear, sipping champagne, waiting for their little entertainment. The sheet music for Mozart's Simple Sonata lay before her, the safe choice everyone expected from a maid playing for her employer's amusement. Her gaze drifted across the sea of faces until she found Leonard Walker in the front row. The legendary jazz pianist sat in his wheelchair, his weathered hands folded in his lap, eyes filled with quiet faith. Their shared history, the hours of lessons, his belief in her talent when no one else saw it, rushed through her mind. His slight nod was all she needed. With a deep breath, Romina pushed the Mozart sheets aside. She closed her eyes and placed her fingers on the keys, letting 15 years of silence, pain, and hidden dreams flow through her fingertips. The first notes emerged tentatively, a haunting melody that spoke of loss. The piece was entirely her own, a composition she'd written in fragments during stolen moments at her silent keyboard. As her confidence grew, so did the music, building from that gentle beginning into something more complex. The crowd's polite smiles faded into expressions of genuine surprise. Julian Kent, the notorious critic Jennifer had invited to witness her humiliation, leaned forward in his seat, brow furrowed in concentration. Romina's hands flew across the keyboard, weaving classical precision with jazz improvisation. The music told her story, the child prodigy's promise, her mother's death, years of invisibility, and the spark that refused to die. The melody soared into a triumphant crescendo that filled the opulent hall. Robert Smith sat frozen, his smug expression replaced by shock, as he realized the woman who cleaned his home possessed a talent that dwarfed anything money could buy. Beside him, Jennifer's face had drained of color, her plan for mockery transformed into an unintended showcase. Michael watched from the side of the room, a proud smile illuminating his features as he witnessed Romina's transformation from invisible servant to commanding artist. In the audience, even the most jaded critics were transformed. Elliot Miller discreetly wiped a tear from his cheek, already composing the headline in his mind. Gloria Brown stood at the back of the room, hands clasped over her heart, witnessing the rebirth of the woman she had quietly supported for years. As the final notes resonated through the hall, Romina opened her eyes to find the room completely still. Not a whisper, not a movement, just the lingering echo of her soul laid bare through music. For the first time in 15 years, she was truly seen. The final note hung in the air like a suspended breath. For 3 heartbeats, the grand ballroom of the Smith mansion remained utterly silent. Then, from the front row, Leonard Walker's weathered hands came together in slow, deliberate applause. The legendary jazz pianist's eyes shimmered with pride as he gazed at his former protégé. Michael Smith joined next, standing from his seat with reverence written across his face. Elliot Miller followed, the music critic's professional composure cracking with genuine emotion. Like a wave, the applause spread through the room until the entire audience was on their feet, a standing ovation that shook the crystal chandeliers. Only Robert Smith remained seated, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The billionaire's planned entertainment had transformed into something he couldn't control. His fingers gripped the armrests of his chair as he watched his wealthy guests celebrate the woman he had intended to humiliate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elliot called out as the applause began to subside, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to addressing crowds. "What you've just witnessed is extraordinary. This isn't merely a talented maid. This is Romina Johnson, the prodigy who stunned Carnegie Hall 15 years ago before disappearing from the music world entirely." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as recognition dawned on the faces of the older guests. Romina stood by the piano, her borrowed black dress suddenly feeling inadequate under the spotlight of attention. A tragic loss forced her from the stage. Elliot continued, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "Tonight we've been privileged to witness her triumphant return." From the third row, an elegant woman in her 60s rose to her feet. "Miss Johnson," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm Catherine Williams, director of the Curtis Institute. We would be honored to offer you a place in our advanced fellowship program, effective immediately." The crowd erupted again, this time with gasps and renewed applause. Gloria Brown wiped tears from her eyes, nodding with maternal pride from her position near the service entrance. At the back of the room, Jennifer Smith's face contorted with humiliation. The socialite had invited half of New York's elite music scene to witness what she thought would be a mockery. Now her cruel plan had backfired spectacularly. She pushed through the crowd and fled the ballroom, her designer heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. Romina stood still amid the chaos, her hands, the same hands that had scrubbed toilets that morning, now being celebrated for creating something beautiful. For the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to feel the music, not as a wound but as a homecoming. Romina Johnson slipped away from the thunderous applause, her heart pounding against her ribs. Finding refuge in a small antechamber off the main hall, she collapsed onto a velvet settee, her borrowed black dress pooling around her. For the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to truly feel everything: the grief for her mother that had silenced her music, the relief of finally being heard, and something new, a fragile sense of belonging. Her fingers still tingled from the keys, muscle memory awakened after years of forced dormancy. Through the door she could hear the excited murmurs of the crowd, their world forever altered by what they'd witnessed. The maid they had expected to humiliate had instead humbled them all.